I see we have a good crowd today. You want the date and all of that?
Yes, I forgot.
This is January 24th, 1998. It's our first presentation of the year. And we do this once a month, every month of the year. Some aspect of history or culture pertaining to Orange County. And this is it. I'm here to introduce Marvin H. Cohen, who is the president and the curator of the Middletown Historical Society. He is a lifelong railroad fan and a serious collector of railroad memorabilia. And he will entertain today with a program about the heyday of the old New York, Ontario, and Western Railway, formerly an important link between Orange County and other points on the eastern seaboard. Mr. Cohen, who is a native of Middletown, is also past president of the Monhegan Hose Company, #1, of the Middletown Fire Department. He's the past president of the Catskill Fire Cats, an old fire truck organization, and secretary of the Orange County Firefighters Exhibition Materials Museum. He supervised also in the supervision of the mounting of the exhibit downstairs in conjunction with this program. So everybody just sit back and relax. I'll let you.
Okay. We're going to just take a break.
Everybody else gave their history, I'll tell you mine. I'm 70 years old. I never worked for a railroad. And I've lived in Middletown all my life so far. My earliest railroad memory was probably seeing the NYO&W passenger trainmen walking to work in their uniforms, carrying their black grips. And I remember the big NYO&W shop whistle that blew every morning at 7 o'clock. That was my alarm clock to wake up to go to school. My mother didn't drive. When we would walk downtown along Wickham Avenue, I remember frequently seeing the gates go down. Sometimes it would just be a switch engine. One day the gates went down as we came up to the crossing. There were a lot of people walking in those days. And a lot of them ducked under the gates and walked across the tracks, and the gate man would blow a whistle at them. But this one day, I remember a long northbound freight train came along very slowly, going up towards the yards. And as it was crossing Wickham Avenue, long before the caboose got in sight, the train stopped and stayed there. And a lot of the automobiles turned around, made U-turns, and tried to find another way to get across the tracks. And of course, we waited. And in the meantime, a lot of the people have walked under the gates, and they were standing right alongside the train. And finally, I remember it started up with a shudder going through each of the cars. And finally, very, very slowly, the caboose came by, and the trainman was standing on the back platform. Now, I don't know how old I could have been, not very old, but I've always remembered that for some reason. Now, across the street from us, we lived on Lincoln Street. Across the street lived a man named Clarence Massey. He was a salesman for the H.J. Heinz Company. And all day he would go up to Sullivan County and around Orange County to grocery stores and restaurants and hotels and try to sell Heinz products. And in the afternoon, he'd come back and write up all his orders. And then in the evening, he would often, but he had a nephew that lived with them, about my age, named Bob Patmore, and we used to play together. And after he would have his orders all written up, he'd put them in a big manila envelope addressed to Heinz in Pittsburgh, and get in the car, and sometimes we would go with him, and drive down to the NYO&W station. And the southbound passenger train would be sitting there. And Mr. Massey would go up to the railway post office car and hand in his envelope, and the clerk would weigh it and sell him the proper number of stamps. And see, he knew everybody. He knew all the railway clerks. He knew all the O&W people. And while he was doing that with the postal car, I'd be standing over by the big drive wheels of the locomotive. And eventually, Mr. Massey would come back and he'd always chat with the engineer. Sometimes the engineer would be oiling around down on the ground. Sometimes he'd be up in the cab. And they'd joke back and forth. And finally, when the time for the train came for the train to leave, I remember the train just start the bell ringing and just ease down to Wickham Avenue crossing very, very slowly. And the gate man would lean out his window and blow a blast on his whistle and lower those long wooden gates. And he wouldn't start to accelerate until the gates were all the way down. And we would stand there and watch until the train went out of sight. On the O&W, on the steam engine of the O&W, the whole bell swung. So the sound sounded like ding, 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 ding. And I've always recalled that. On the Erie, just the clapper swung. So that would go like ding, 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 ding. A completely different sound to the Erie and the O&W. Two houses down from us on Lincoln Street lived a man named Guy Michaels, M-I-K-L-E-S. And I was only a kid, but I mean, he knew me from seeing me playing there on the sidewalk. On June 10th, 1938, during Middletown's Golden Jubilee Parade, the O&W's newly refurbished train, the Mountaineer, was on display at Wickham Avenue Station. And it sat over about 3 or 4 tracks from the station, with the engine facing south. The engine was down near Wickham Avenue crossing. And everybody was going through the train. But I wanted to go up in the engine, so I climbed up in the engine, and there was Mr. Michaels, his road foreman of engines at the time. So I sat in the engineer's seat, and I said to him, "Can I blow the whistle?" He says, "No, there's no steam up." He says, "Well, can I ring the bell?" He says, "No, there's no steam up." So I didn't think much of the whole thing, and I went home. Now, Bob Atmore's father had been laid off as an O&W trainman, and he had taken a job as a brakeman on the Long Island Railroad. And one Friday evening, Mr. Massey took us to the Wickham Avenue station and put us on a train for Weehawken. And I remember the engineer was Mr. Schoolmaker. And Mr. Massey said to him, now Shuey, give the boys a good ride. You're going to New York on your train." And I don't remember anything much about the train ride, but I remember taking the ferry. Bob's father met us at Weehawken, and we took the ferry to New York, and we took the 42nd Street trolley. And somehow we got to Long Island City, just about under the Hellgate Bridge where his father lived. The next day, we rode bicycles out to North Beach where they were building the new LaGuardia Airport, because we were hoping to see one of the new Pan Am flying boats that used to land there. Now, my father took me to the World's Fair in 1939, and I can vividly remember that huge engine, number 6100, the Pennsylvania Railroad 6446, lettered American Railroads. The engine ran on rollers, and it would go 100 miles an hour standing still. I can still remember those rods going back and forth and those drivers turning. Now, the following year, we took a trip out to Milwaukee to visit relatives. Of course, there was no superhighways then, there was no motels. I remember we stayed overnight in Pittsburgh in a hotel, and I asked my father for 10 cents to buy a railroad magazine that was on the newsstand. And the next day, or maybe the day after, I don't know, we passed Fort Wayne, Indiana. And just on the other side of Fort Wayne, we're paralleling the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks. And of course, I was looking out for trains. And all at once, behind us here came number 6100, pulling a long Tuscan red Pennsylvania passenger train. And of course, my father speeded up, but it was no use. He must have been doing 90 with this long train, and I think I looked it up and found out that that train was the Admiral. And that was some sight to see that number 6100 pulling a passenger train. It must have been around Memorial Day 1947 when I went to the O&W station to watch the trains go into Sullivan County. One train was at the station with all the people in the restaurant. Another train was behind him, just south of the Wickham Avenue crossing. And behind that were two more trains side by side. Now, the coaches said Central Railroad of New Jersey and Seaboard. They're all open window day coaches. And when those trains finally left, the ground by the station was just white with candy wrappers and ice cream wrappers and paper plates. I have vivid memories of the long lines of automobiles going to Sullivan County, but that's the only railroad memory that I've got. I went down one, I guess it was Easter weekend of 1948. I was on a trip with Royce Towner. We found ourselves in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I went down to the Chesapeake and Ohio yards, and there was passenger engine number 490 sitting there. This was a streamlined Hudson type with a silver and orange casing. And I took a picture of it. And the engineer motioned me over to come up in the cab. So I went up in the cab of it, and he took me down as far as the passenger station. I remember walking back. And another time when I was in New Mexico, I was taking a picture of a brand new Santa Fe freight diesel on a train. And again, the engineer said, come on up in the cab. Great, so I went up in the cab. And the fireman said, come on back, I'll show you the engines. So we were back in the B unit. The train started up. By the time I got back up to the cab, the engineer, looked at me and was in surprise, and he said, you'll have to get off. So I got down on the lowest step of the diesel and let go and landed in the desert. This was all sand, and I didn't get hurt. But anyway, one time, Towner and I were driving across the country in 1950. And for some reason I've never been able to figure out, we didn't stay overnight. We drove night and day. And one time in Arizona, we were so tired that we pulled the car over. It was a 1948 Plymouth. Pulled the car over the side of the road and fell asleep. And I was laying across the front seat, and he was laying across the back seat. All at once, both fast asleep, all at once, a huge headlight shone right in the car, and the sound of an air horn, and a Southern Pacific cab in front engine came by, and we had no idea we were so close to the tracks. So, the only thing is, in those days I was interested in taking pictures of scenery, not black steam engines, which were all over the place. In 1942, the very beginning of the war, I was with a Boy Scout group that went to Philmont, New Mexico. We left Middletown on the Erie, took the Santa Fe to Kansas City and on to Philmont, New Mexico, which is near Raton Pass. And coming back, I remember we got off the train at Jamestown, New York, and took an Erie Gas Electric to Niagara Falls. Of course, when I was in the Army, we rode trains all the time. And when I was sent overseas, right at the end of the war, I had a government railroad ticket from Middletown to Pittsburgh, California. I took the Erie to Chicago and the Grand Canyon Limited to Barstow, California. And the Grand Canyon had open window coaches. and of course steam engines. And I was black when I finally got to the Army camp. To get back to Middletown after the war, the diesels arrived. And I remember one old engineer saying, "I'm not going to drive those goddamn trolley cars." You see, the crews not only had to learn how to run the engines, but they had to go to school to learn the basics of electricity, how the engines worked, and how to make running repairs. And they set up classes in the high school at night, and the science teachers taught the course. And one old engineer whom I knew, Roscoe Cunningham, he never did learn the diesels. He stuck with steam and ran the last steam switcher in Middletown. And when that was dieselized, he retired. And I can recall seeing him running engine number 53 in the north yards up at Sand Station, waving at him. I can remember, because I should say that my father had an Esso gasoline station and a wholesale gasoline and fuel oil business. And a lot of the O&W people had Esso credit cards, and they'd come in for gasoline. I remember Roy Wilson, who was chief of police. Wilbur Wilson, the train master, used to come in. I knew Tom Gerard, the superintendent anyway, because I knew his daughter Barbara from school. Ralph Wright, the general manager, used to come in. When Chief Wilson retired from the police, Andy Dozak became chief of police. One day he came in and said, "Fill it up, I'm in a big hurry, there's a wreck up in Luzon." So I got in my car and drove up there. Just one or two cars off the track. It wasn't even worth getting out to take a picture of it. I went to the Chicago Railroad Fair in both 1949 and 1950. And one of the most popular exhibits was the General Motors Train of Tomorrow, which featured Vista Dome streamlined passenger cars. On April 12, 1949, I got a phone call at work. Get right over to the O&W station. And just as I got there, here came the Train of Tomorrow. What an incongruous sight. How those dome cars had ever fit through Highview Tunnel, I couldn't imagine. I spoke to one of the crew and told him I'd seen the train in Chicago. And he said he never believed railroad tracks could be so rough as on the O&W. A delegation of civic leaders from Poughkeepsie boarded the train in Middletown for a ride over the Poughkeepsie Bridge. In the fall of 1952, there was a small notice in the Middletown paper that Hines, H-I-N-E-S, Hines Lodge number 1033, the Brotherhood of Railway Clerks, was going to sponsor a fall foliage trip over the O&W to Scranton. And I realized this would be my only chance to ride over that line, and I was determined to get a ticket. So I asked one of the female secretaries that came in to try to get me a ticket, and she did. Now, the train was made up of one A unit, a heater car, a baggage car, a coach, and an observation car. Practically everybody on the train was an employee, and they all knew each other. The people were going up to the engine, so I made my way up there. But the cab was full. There must have been 20 people in that cab. No room for me. So I rode for a while in the heater car looking out the porthole, but that was pretty rough. I went back and stood near the observation platform, but of course that was full too. After we left Kedosia, we started down the Scranton Division and stopped at Mayfield Yard, where all the employees greeted each other. We finally went to the end of the O&W's track in Scranton. And they said, walk 2 blocks and you can catch a trolley for downtown Scranton. So I walked over to the Lackawanna yards and took some pictures and promptly got kicked out. So I went back and told that to one of the O&W men. And he said, you go back there. If anybody tries to kick you out, tell them come see me. But I had already taken the pictures that I wanted. And on the way back from Scranton after dark, They set card tables up in the baggage car, and everybody brought bottles out, and they had a good time on the way back. And again, I tried to go up in the cab, but it was still full with the secretary sitting on the engineer's lap. The following year, another trip was announced to go to Norwich, and again I got a ticket. I did get a cab ride north out of Cadosia Yard, almost to Sydney. And on the way back that evening, I guess the engineer was trying to show the secretaries how fast the engine would go, because the coaches were rocking and reeling. And Wilbur Wilson went forward and told the engineer to slow down. On April 6, 1951, I happened to be going across the Erie crossing on North Street. And the gates went down, and a set of O&W diesels, 2 units, 2A units, back to back appeared. And they backed down on Erie train number 6 and made their air test. And while I watched, the long passenger train accelerated out of the station going towards Goshen. And the 2 green Erie E8s were sitting on the next track. So I asked the baggage man what was going on. He said, well, their Erie had a derailment, and the train was going to detour over to O&W. So I says, why are they changing engines? He says, well, the E8s wouldn't clear. The Erie engine wouldn't clear. So the train went to Goshen, over to Montgomery Branch to Campbell Hall, down the O&W in the West Shore to Little Ferry, and then over the Susquehanna to Jersey City. I would like to have ridden that train. I have one black and white picture I took of it going across East Main Street crossing. Another time, the Erie had a derailment on the Delaware Division, and they detoured all their freight trains over to O&W. The Erie engines were used with O&W pilots. So many trains were run that the O&W ran out of qualified pilots. I can remember seeing at least one Erie train passing through Wickham Avenue Station. On the Erie, I remember that the Erie Limited would come into Middletown shortly before 11 a.m. In steam days, the engine would whistle 1 long and 3 shorts to call out the flagman. And this gentleman would emerge with his flagging kit over his shoulder and walk back down about opposite Ayers and Galloway's, where other flagmen would just lean against the rear coupler. And then the engine would whistle 5 long blasts to call in the flagman. And you could hear that all over town. Sometimes when the train stopped, half of the rear car would extend over North Street crossing, and the gate man would just put down half the gates. I don't know what year it could have been, but around 8:30 p.m., one of the Erie's gas-electric cars would pull into Middletown and terminate. And I can remember waiting for him at the North Street crossing several times. The exhaust stacks glowed red, and fire came from the stacks when it accelerated. Every afternoon, train 27, the Mountain Express, came into Middletown. This train was usually powered by engine 2509, the 50,000th locomotive to be built by American Locomotive Company. The engine would stop opposite Swift's Packing on Henry Street. There was an engine that should have been preserved. I used to do business with a print shop in Middletown called Trumbull Printing. Once, while I was there, a wholesale paper salesman came in, and I was introduced to him. His name was Ed Hansen, and he was the chairman of the trip committee of the railroad enthusiasts. So I became a member, and I started going on railroad fan trips, usually with steam locomotives. Some of these trips were over the Erie, the Lackawanna, Jersey Central, Reading, B&O, and Pennsylvania. And usually one of the features of these trips was an open gondola car at the end of the train that you could stand in, which is where I usually rode. I usually had a full dining car as part of the train. One day, a good customer and a friend came in and asked to borrow our 1.5-ton open rack truck that we had. I don't remember what year it was, but the O&W had already closed. Well, I got talking to him, and he said he was hired to clean out the O&W station. So he and I went over there to look at it. Now, Andy Dozak was chief of police, and he was now hired to watch the station and the yards and so on. So going through the offices, I said, can I have this, can I have that? Mostly locomotive cyclopedias and interesting books and stuff like that. And he said, oh, sure, you can have it, but wait till tomorrow. I don't want anybody to see you taking stuff out today. Oh, fine. Of course, by tomorrow, that was all gone. If I give him a $20 bill, I'm sure I could have had it. But the following day, a whole crew assembled. Our truck was parked on the platform of the station. The windows of the O&W station were opened, and every file drawer was just dumped out the window, and the paper slid down the roof and into our truck, and what was on the platform, they picked it up. And I was trying to stay ahead of them, going through file cabinets before they dumped them to take whatever looked interesting. And I got several carloads of papers, you know, automobile carloads. And a couple of years later, I was asked to clean out the blueprint wall. And I was able to save all that material, all of which went to the O&W Society. I don't remember what year it was, but a small group of rail fans in Middletown got together and formed the O&W chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. I joined very shortly afterwards, just too late to be on the charter. We used to hold meetings at the Globe Hotel, and later in a small dining room at Club 211. Today, of course, it's a large, thriving organization. In 1960, I noticed that a steam locomotive had appeared in Middletown on the Middletown, New Jersey Railway. It was on a flat car, and I watched them unload it. And of course, I had to get involved. That was the 103 that we ran in Middletown from 1962 to 1966. And when the operation ceased at Middletown, the engine was again loaded on a flat car and sent to Essex, Connecticut to operate on the Valley Railroad. But all the rest of the cars remained in Middletown. Finally, we got the okay to move the coaches, cabooses, boxcar, gondola, and so on up to Essex, Connecticut as a special train over the New Haven. So at 6 a.m. one morning, I appeared at Maybrook Yard to accompany the equipment as a rider. With a very expensive passenger ticket in my hand, I boarded a beat-up Penn Central caboose. And immediately we ran into problems. There was an over-dimensioned car that had to go to Danbury, and they ordered it to be put in to the museum train. And the conductor refused to take it. He said, this is a special train and has nothing to do with any other freight. So the train master came along and he gave the conductor a direct order to take that car. The conductor refused. So they put it up to me. What do you want to do? Do you want to take it or not? I said, sure, we're going right by Danbury. Why not take it? So now the conductor wouldn't speak to me. So the train master said, I'm going to ride along and make sure there's no problems. So I got on the caboose, and I rode on the back platform of the caboose going across the Poughkeepsie Bridge, which I'm very glad I was able to do. When we stopped at Hopewell Junction to let a westbound freight by, I got up in the cab of the engine and rode there for the rest of the trip. And after setting out the over-dimensioned car in Danbury, we entered the 4-track main line of the New Haven at Devon, changed crews at New Haven, and finally got up to Old Saybrook, Connecticut. It was quite an experience. When I joined the Middletown Fire Department in 1951, I found that many of the members were O&W men. Of course, I was young then, and most of them were past middle age. But some of the railroad men in the Manhattans that I knew were Glenn Cayley, Edmund Brown, Milton Conklin, Carl Arkels, Edgar Baden, and Bill McEwen, who was an old-time engineer. When we got married in 1955, our first landlord was Mr. Aaron Holtz, an engineer, who was then working as a hostler. The huge snowstorm in the winter of 1947 almost paralyzed the area. We had a bulk storage plant out at the end of Sand Station Road on the O&W. And at that time, only the state had plows big enough to cope with snow like that. My father hired a cement mixer with a snow plow that finally let our trucks get through. I remember the O&W was plowing with bulldozers. I was never obsessed with one or two railroads. I traveled pretty widely and I photographed whatever offered. I still subscribe to railroad magazines from the United States, Britain, and Europe. I've ridden trains in many parts of this country, in Canada, in Europe, and Japan. But it always comes back to what you grew up with. The New York, Ontario, and Western has been gone for 40 years. It employed hundreds of men and women and provided a livelihood for hundreds of families. It was the largest employer in the city of Middletown and in many towns all along the line. May its memory last forever, and I'm sure it will. Thank you.